Hey there, and welcome back. So, we are now on the fourth module in our team leadership course, and we're talking about the third element of team leadership, which is consent. Now, contrary to what you might have thought when you first saw this word, we're not talking about sexual harassment. You're not going to get like an HR lecture today. I mean, now granted, if you have a high level of consent and that's part of your culture at your work, you're probably not going to deal with sexual harassment issues all that often because consent breeds respect, mutual respect for everybody. And when it's not there, it's noticeable. But let's dig into the materials so I can show you what I mean. So, again, we are on number three, consent. Next week, we're going to be talking about clarity. And I think that it's much easier to get clear with each other when we have consent from them, if they're even open to what we're about to say. And then we're going to talk about boundaries, which is very closely tied to consent. So, you'll see some overlap there. But consent is kind of asking for openness, where boundaries is communicating your needs and respecting the needs of others. Just to give you a little preview of where we're looking. And I hope that you have had an opportunity to practice gratitude this last week. I hope you've had an opportunity to, you know, share with the people in your organization what you see them doing well and right, being very effusive and elaborating on what they're doing well so they know how to do more of it. If you've had some success stories, head over to our LinkedIn group and share them with us because we love to hear those. So I love this quote by Dwight D. Eisenhower. He says, "This world of ours must avoid becoming a community of dreadful fear and hate and be instead a proud confederation of mutual trust and respect." So I like to think about this, obviously, through the lens of an organization. How awesome would it be to go into an organization every single day and know that it's going to be a community of mutual trust and respect, and that, dreadful fear and hate, hopefully you're not quite at that point, but any sort of dreadful fear and hate or negativity and, gossip, things like that aren't part of the culture. So, our learning objectives, I'm sure you are very familiar with these by now, but they're important, right? We want to know what consent is and what it's not. We want to know what it looks like in an organization, in an environment, when leaders are practicing it and facilitating it with their team and their staff, and when they're not, and why it matters for leadership. Like, why is consent such an unbelievably important tool for leaders? And how can you start integrating it, even during or after this module? So, in terms of all of our bad definitions in each of our modules, this is probably the okayest one of them, ironically, because consent does really mean getting the okay, but it's more than that. It's getting the okay for pretty much everything, making sure that person is comfortable and getting their buy-in, which may seem weird in a world that operates on directives, but even making sure they're okay taking on that directive can make the difference and how engaged they are with it versus feeling like a mundane task. So for our purposes, consent is respectfully asking for openness, for engagement, and ownership of responsibility. Consent, here's really the moment where you help your team be self leaders, where you give them autonomy and you ask them if they're willing to take it on. You gauge how much help they need. And it shows that you have respect for them and you care about their wants, their needs, and what they're capable of, right? Because they may feel like they're not up to the task and you want to know that before you give them that task. Our analogy for this week, I love this video. Dogs are not people, except this dog. Um, but listen, you give a command to a dog, and you hope, with good training and a lot of money and a private dog trainer, if you have a bulldog at home like I do. But hopefully they follow that command, right? a good dog is really a dog that follows the command, that knows the rules of the household. When you say sit, when you say sit, they sit. When you say come here, they come. When you tell them please do not jump on people, Charlotte, they my dog's name, they don't jump on people or attack them with kisses. But people are not dogs, okay? They have preferences, they have opinions, they have values. My dog might have some preferences and opinions and values, and she objects to the command. But in human beings, we need to be respectful of that and create that culture of respect. People are just not dogs, except for this little guy. But you wouldn't ask a dog for its permission. Please come here. Is that okay with you? But people, even in a mundane, repetitive, menial job, it can be really helpful to show them the respect of asking for their buy-in. They deserve that. They deserve to be asked for consent. So let's use some familiar examples where this may pop up in the workplace, because I know this is a subject that you may not have discussed in the past, to this degree. Um, but let's say it's gossip, okay? Have you ever been, let's use the proverbial standing at the water cooler, and someone comes up to you and starts talking about like how annoying Jerry was last week? Always Jerry. And you just don't freaking want to hear it. And then you feel really irritated that this person was like, just confronting you or sharing with you this gossip that you're really not interested in and you don't like that as part of your culture. And then you're kind of put in this weird situation because either you shut them down and then you're a jerk, or you have to like participate in it, or you kind of nod and smile and you're passive aggressive and you walk away. Right. So that person didn't ask for your consent. If they did ask for your consent, it probably would have inhibited them from starting the conversation in the first place. The same goes for advice. You know, and this is a well-meaning lack of consent where you or somebody else wants to share with you some advice that they think would be really really helpful, like, oh, you have this problem, let me tell you how I fixed it, let me tell you how I would fix it, let me share with you. But maybe you're running out the door to pick up your dog from its play group. I don't know, that's a very lucky dog. Or you're running out the door to let your dog out, or you're running out the door to meet with a client, or you have any other number of things going on and you are not ready to hear that advice. Or maybe it's advice from somebody who you just don't want to hear it from them, or maybe you are planning on addressing it later. It's really helpful when you want to give advice or when you're receiving advice for that person or for you to say, you know is this a good time? Like, I'd love to share some ideas with you that worked for me. Would that be helpful? And is now a good time? Or would you want to hear that in the future? Like those kinds of questions, like just testing out, are you even interested? And if you are interested, when, because I'm here for you. That's much more respectful than just telling people advice that they may not want to hear and probably won't follow anyway. And opinions are a big one. Like, nobody cares about your opinions, Jerry. Unless you ask them if they care about their opinions. Then those are the people to share your opinions with. All right. So ask people first. Can I just share my opinion with this? And if you have an environment, a culture that has consent and also boundaries, which we'll get to later, then you're also free to say, no, not right now. Like, we can talk about this later. Go talk to the other Jerry. I'm really sorry for anybody who's watching this whose name is Jerry. Like all the poor Karens out there. I hope that makes sense. So let's talk about consent in a corporation where it is out of balance, kind of as an environment. There's probably a lot of lecturing, right? There's a lot of unsolicited advice, and sometimes the advice is unhelpful because the student already knows that stuff. They've just been they've been struggling implementing it, or they've been struggling with some underlying issues. Maybe they would benefit from more self-leadership help, right? Like, it's not as obvious as you think it is. And you're also assuming that the student is open to receiving the information at that moment when they may not be. So it's really helpful to ask for consent before you want to lecture or share information or offer advice. And it's just as simple as saying, hey, I might be able to help you here. When is a good time to share that with you? Or do you even want to hear it? Okay. And then when they say, yes, I'm open to it, then they're receptive as opposed to being resistant. Conflict is a big one where strong values are not respected because you're not asking for consent and assessing where those values are. Or you're assuming something's okay based on previous interactions. Like you want to go complain about Jerry at the water cooler, right? And last time, the person you're speaking with was like, oh, yeah, I can't believe that guy. I'm sorry, Jerry. And so you assume that this time it's okay too, but it may not be. I mean, also just in general, gossiping is probably a bad idea. But if you do need to share, if you do need to offload, asking like, I just need to offload right now, and sometimes that can be healthy. But also, if you need to do that, it might be better to call a coach who's outside of your organization. Just saying. But asking for forgiveness later, we'll just do it and say you're sorry later if they don't like it. That can lead to a lot of conflict because we're just assuming they're going to get over it or assuming they're going to be okay instead of taking time to ask if they're okay with whatever it is that you're about to do. Unsolicited fixing also happens, or wanting to fix or trying to push a fix, and this might happen with just like improving another person's system, like going into their office and cleaning it for them. Like, who would do that? But that happens, right? And again, this also relates to boundaries, right? Or just doing it for them as opposed to offering help and asking like, where can I support you here? Do you want me to take this off of your plate? Would that be helpful to you right now? Or pushing solutions. Straight up, I am guilty of pushing solutions. I do not know why, but when I find a new product that I really love, um, I become a walking commercial for it. And it becomes really important for me that all my friends also love that product and buy that product. When I sit back and I'm like, what? I am not getting paid to push this product. Like, why do I care so much? Okay. Maybe I should ask them for consent. Like, hey, do you want to hear about this awesome new product that I came across? I'm super geeked out about it. Can I share it with you? And most of my friends would be like, oh yeah, okay, Sarah. But sometimes they're just like, no, I don't care about your product. And you want people in your life who you can say, no, I don't care. And you're like, fine. And you tell somebody else. An environment where there's not a lot of consent can also feel like a pressure cooker because leaders don't take time to assess each person's individual tolerance levels. Remember, we talked about that stress bucket and where people may be in chronic stress. If you aren't taking time to assess that, to figure out if they can put this on their plate, then that can make somebody feel really, really overwhelmed. And oftentimes, limitations, especially obvious ones, when you just need something done as a leader, you don't ask for consent on purpose because you don't want to know the limitation, in which case you are overworking your team. And this also happens where you just assume that an employee will work extra hours to meet the objective that is so important to you and the team, but maybe that person has boundaries. They have a child at home they need to take care of, or they just don't want to live their job, and that's okay. And again, we'll talk about this more with boundaries, but it's hard to respect boundaries when you don't ask what those boundaries are, right? And that's why consent comes first. So let's talk about consent imbalance. Look at all of these happy people. Yay, we feel respected in our culture. uh, a culture of consent has more conversations and less directives, which we've talked about in other modules, but especially in this one. There's a lot of asking. Is this a good time? Is this topic okay? How do you feel about this project? Do you have the capacity? But most of these questions are open ended, which we'll definitely dig into in the clarity module next. I think open ended questions are probably one of the most single important tool that I can give you. So do not miss the clarity module because that will change the way you interact with your team. But here, in terms of asking for consent, this is, showing them before you have those conversations, before you ask those questions, is now even a good time, and then listening, right? And following up with another question or some clarification, but having more conversations. That's what happens in an environment of consent. There's also a lot of compromise because you can determine values before giving a directive, and they might say, I can do that, but not this. So you're able to work with that. You're able to work with their weaknesses, their strengths, accept their limitations, and ideally, you have a big enough team where you can, assign your tasks each according to strengths. And if you do assign a task that is someone's weakness, you know that ahead of time. So you know that you'll have to be there more to support them and help them through it. But there's a lot more compromise. There's give and take between you and your team and between each team member as well when they're working on a task. And you also act as more of a facilitator. You let go of control, you trust, and it makes it easier for you to trust and delegate because you've asked the right questions. You've asked if they're open to it. And when they buy in, you can tell, did they really buy in? You've asked about their limitations. You've asked about, like what's realistic here in terms of the time frame when this can get done. And you check in on a regular basis to offer support, to be there for them. You are paving the way for them, you're facilitating it, but you're not doing it for them. And you're not assuming that they're going to do it. You're asking and then supporting. And what happens with the team when there's consent and respect and safety, and everyone is heard and seen and asked? They thrive. The employees feel respected. When they take ownership of that task, they feel a sense of autonomy, that ownership and that responsibility. And that really drives them through. I see this on my team all the time. I really try to practice what I preach. And it's so fun to see my staff try new things. They feel respected. They know that I've asked them if it's okay to take on this task. So when they take it on, they feel a sense of pride. And that's what you want. You want them to feel a sense of pride, not a sense of like drudgery and oppression and, oh, I don't want to do this. I can't believe I have to do this. And some people, sometimes they just have to do a task, but then that's still a conversation of consent. Like, this really has to be done. You know, what do you need from me to help you do it? Even that alone, right? Is it like it has to be done? This is part of your job, but like I'm here to support you, right? So it's asking for consent in the sense of, what do you need from me to help? So you're supporting just instead of just assuming they're going to do it, right? So consent is really you're just never assuming. You're making sure that you always ask. It sounds like, would you be open to? How do you feel about? If you were to do this, what would you need? It's taking inventory of how a person feels about this so they can be clear about the responsibility. And then when they take ownership, they get that sense of pride. It's so powerful. So I think it may be obvious at this point, that this can really help with leadership. But let's break it down. Would you rather work for a leader without an attitude of consent, who doesn't practice consent, or someone who does? Do you want to work with someone who gives unsolicited advice or asks if a topic is okay to discuss? So you're ready for it when you're going to have the discussion. Who makes assumptions, just assumes that it's okay, or asks questions about it? Who makes arbitrary improvements to systems without considering, how you feel about it and how that would change your role or the team's role, or ask your opinion about it? I like to be asked my opinion if someone's going to change something, and sometimes changes just happen, but then at least ask, how do you feel about it? How can I help support you? Those kinds of supportive questions. And do you want to work for someone who withholds support because they just assume that you're going to do it and then criticizes you later when you fall short, even though you had very little support, or offers support throughout? Who assumes you have no limitations and you can work day in and out, and you're good at everything, or accepts and acknowledges and respects your limitations? And would you rather work for someone who disrespects your values or who asks which values you have and which ones they need to respect and how they can best respect them? Having those discussions is really important because again, it makes everybody at your organization feel really safe and it creates that culture of safety so you can be successful and everyone is bringing their highest brain function to work. So even though it may seem annoying, I imagine you may be feeling that way on the other side of this recording. Even though it may feel annoying that I'm asking you to ask everybody for consent, it's for the purpose of helping your team thrive and be more successful in the long run. So, clarity next week is going to be all about questions, right? Because we see everything, as you know, from self awareness through our own lens. And clarity is about understanding the lens through which each person is viewing the world. And in order to have those kinds of conversations, empathizing with them and then asking for consent is really important. And then once you've asked for consent, you've empathized, you're clear, the boundaries appear inherently, and people start to respect boundaries a lot better and have a much easier time clarifying their own boundaries because you've already showed them consent and that you respect their values. If that's not clear enough, it will continue to become clear as we move through the rest of this course. Let's review. So, consent is sometimes just getting the okay, but it can be a much more powerful tool than that. If you define it as respectfully asking for openness, engagement, and ownership of responsibility. When you get their buy-in, you're also allowing yourself to trust them to do it in a supportive way where you still check in and support them, and then they are able to feel that sense of pride, and then you feel that sense of pride that they feel a sense of pride as your leader, and it's really a much more exciting, engaging, fun environment to work in. So to see it all in one, okay, when consent is out of balance, there's a lot of lecturing, conflict, unsolicited fixing, and it can feel like a pressure cooker because a leader tends to just assume that everyone is capable of everything and can work all hours. And that's an extreme, right? But it looks like some version of that. And when it's in balance, there's a lot of conversation, a lot of compromise, and a leader really facilitates as opposed to gives directives. And you see the team thrive. It's very, very exciting and fun to watch everyone work so hard. And it sounds like, would you be open to? How does it sound if, what would, if we were to give you this project, what would you struggle with? Things like that. It's just digging in and figuring out, like, how does this person feel about taking this on? I respect you and I want to make sure you feel confident taking this on because I want to see you succeed. All right. We defined consent and we've talked about it in detail of what it looks like when you're practicing it and what it looks like when you're not. And we know why it matters. All right. It's going to help create that environment of respect and social safety so everyone can thrive. But integrating it can be really tough because it's not natural for us to to create this environment of consent. It's just not. It's not something that we are taught in parochial school. So, a couple of questions that can help guide you this week. First one, how can you naturally introduce the concept of asking for consent right now? This may be as simple as practicing, hey, is now a good time? Or, hey, I'd like to have a conversation with you about blank. How would you feel about that? Just in your next meeting, you know, how would you guys feel if we openly discussed blank? Just asking that how, all right? But and you think of a way that feels even more natural for you in your own language, as long as your objective is to gauge people's buy-in and make sure they feel comfortable with where you're going to go. And then ask yourself, where do you make too many assumptions? Is there an area where you do tend to assume that other people are okay? I have a tendency after work to call my mom or my best friend and emotionally dump on them. And one time my mom was like, "Okay, Sarah, I just need a minute because you're really intense right now." And then I realized I did not ask if that was okay. I just assumed it was okay because I do it often. But so now when I call her, I try to say, "Mom, I just need to complain about something right now. Can I do that?" And she's like, "Sure." Or she's like, "No, call your friend." And my friend knows that she can say the exact same thing. And sometimes I've just left a journal. But the point is, you don't want to just assume that something is okay. You want to ask for consent first before you talk to someone about something, especially if you're feeling really charged about it. And then, speaking of something that you feel really charged about, are there specific subjects on the receiving end where you wish that someone else would ask your consent before discussing? Politics, religion, another person at your workplace. But is there a particular area where you would appreciate someone asking for your consent? That's a really good jumping off point, a really good starting point for you to start to evaluate how you can use this in your life with others. Because you can say, okay, well, how do I feel about this? How might others feel about this? We're essentially using empathy to figure out where to start using consent. It all blends together. All right, so those questions might give you some ideas about a teeny tiny action step you can do this week. But I would really encourage you to try to use an action step where you are, asking somebody in your life, even if it's not, your somebody at work, right? But somebody in your life. You can start with your mom, you can start with your spouse, you can start with your kids, whoever is in your life, your best friend. Start asking them for consent. Is it okay if I talk about this topic? And you might find that with those people that the answer is no, or you may find that they're much more engaged with you in the conversation. But figure out places in your life this week where asking for consent can help stretch your ability here so it starts to become more normal and natural for you in the workplace. Or do something different that's your own. You can pick whatever action step you want. And then when you choose it, go to our LinkedIn group. I ask you this every week because I think that learning from our peers is an incredible resource. And share your insights. If you learn something new that you never thought of before, oh, I never viewed it like that before. I never realized that connection. Share that stuff. We all want to know it. I especially want to know it because I like affirmation. And share the action steps that you are taking this week to give other people ideas. So, next week, we're talking about clarity. This is an incredibly important module because we are going to go in detail about the power of open ended questions, which is a tool, it is the most commonly used tool that I offer the executives that I coach. And so, really quick, in balance and out of balance, or out of balance and in balance. Out of balance, it looks like there's too many directives. There's a lot of assuming with clarity too, but not necessarily assuming that something is okay, like it was for consent. It's more assuming that they understand the directive. Uh, when you have a lack of clarity, you tend to have a narrow focus, and there's a lot of misunderstandings. Where when it's in balance and working really well in your organization, there are lots of open-ended questions, much more listening than talking, big picture thinking, and everyone's thinking in sync. And that is so powerful because you see the team really thrive to an even higher degree. So, your summary statement, if you remember nothing else this week but this, remember that consent creates an environment of respect. And I can only imagine that that is what you want for your culture and your organization. Thanks so much. I'm so excited to talk to you about clarity next week, and I'll see you before you know it.